It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the BenQ EL2870U. This video review complements a longer and more detailed written review. You can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. It's worth remembering that what you see on this video depends on my camera, it depends on my video editing software, it depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately it depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on. So what you see does not represent how the monitor actually looks firsthand. It's not possible to actually show that on video, but it does let me go through certain attributes of the monitor and sort of guide you through things in a more visual way than the written review does. This monitor features a 28-inch, or more specifically 27.9-inch TN panel with a 3840 by 2160 4K UHD resolution. The monitor uses a medium matte or relatively light matte, depending on how you choose to classify it, anti-glare screen surface, which provides quite strong glare handling characteristics. It also gives a slightly grainy look to the image, especially when you're looking at lighter colours such as white. It's not as smooth as some matte screen surfaces, but it isn't a sort of heavy smeary graininess either, so it's not too bad in that respect. The resolution itself, 3840 by 2160 on a screen of this size, does give you a very nice pixel density. It gives you a nice amount of desktop real estate, so you get lots of useful workspace to use for productivity purposes. And I'm actually using 125% scaling at the moment. Without scaling, I found things just a bit too small. Some users would find it okay, but the vast majority will want to use some degree of scaling on a monitor like this. We've got an article called the 4K UHD Experience, which explores this in a bit more detail. But 125% I'm quite happy to use, and for the tasks I do on the computer, I don't have an issue with having to use scaling. Even with that, you get a really nice amount of useful desktop space, as you can see on Excel here, loads of cells visible at the same time. It also gives very good multitasking potential, so you can browse the internet and also have Excel or whatever other application open. It's great for procrastinators. And in terms of viewing high resolution image content, the pixel density is good for that as well. Suitably high resolution movies and certainly games. And in terms of gaming, the pixel density does deliver a noticeable benefit to keen-eyed viewers like myself compared to 27-inch WQHD models, that's 2560 by 1440. Even if it's an older game with perhaps not the most refined graphics and not particularly high resolution textures or fancy effects or anything like that, even then you get a certain clarity, especially when you look at objects in the distance, which is just lacking from models with a lower pixel density. And if the game does actually use high resolution textures and fancy visual effects and that kind of thing, you will notice these looking a lot sharper and a lot more detailed as well. And this does depend on your viewing distance and eyesight and various other things, but to me I definitely notice a big difference comparing this to models with significantly lower pixel density. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. It uses a medium or relatively light, depending on how you choose to classify it, matte anti-glare screen surface. This provides effective glare handling. You can see a bit of glare, but that is because the monitor's switched off and I'm in a very bright room, and also it's exaggerated a bit by the video. So generally speaking, glare isn't really an issue with this monitor. But regardless of screen surface, you should always try to avoid direct light or strong light striking the screen surface directly. I also explore a bit about what the medium matte anti-glare screen surface means for the image quality a bit later on in the review. The bottom bezel is quite thick and it has a sort of medium grey matte quality to it. The stand has a brushed matte texture with a slightly darker grey colour, or it appears slightly darker, perhaps because of the texture. The stand base is glossy plastic. There's also a sensor unit here which hangs below the bottom bezel, and that's for the Brightness Intelligence Plus function of the monitor, which is explored in the OSD video. At the top and sides, the bezels are fairly thick. They're not super thick, but they're certainly thicker than some designs you'll see with so-called edge-to-edge or dual bezel designs where you get a very thin, hard outer component and a visible panel border on the screen which is quite thin. On this model, the panel border is pretty much entirely covered by the physical matte black plastic bezel. There's also the OSD controls, which are explored in the OSD video. They're at the bottom of the monitor. There's also a power LED. There's also an HDR/brightness intelligence plus button, which is explored in the written review and in the OSD video. And you can see there's a kind of vinyl effect, shiny copper label to that. I don't find it particularly eye-catching when I'm just using the monitor, but you can certainly see that it's there. From the side, there's not really an awful lot to talk about. It has a pretty thin profile. It's not super slim, but there are reasons for that, and I'll come on to that when I show you the rear. The monitor is predominantly matte black plastic. There are 100 by 100mm VESA holes, and that's one of the reasons the monitor isn't super thin. It does kind of lump out in the central region because you need to have the screws going into there, and you don't want it to eat into the screen of the monitor, obviously. There's also a Kensington lock slot towards the bottom right. Stand attachment point, again glossy black plastic on the stand neck. This attaches using a quick release mechanism. You can press the little button there and it'll release the stand, and you can pull the screen off, and then you can attach your alternative stand if you prefer. The included stand only affords very limited ergonomic flexibility to the monitor, so you can just tilt it back a little bit and tilt it forwards a bit as well. The ports are down firing. And they include an AC power input. That's another reason the monitor is not super thin. So it has an internal power converter and it doesn't have an external power brick. You've then got two HDMI 2.0 ports, DisplayPort 1.4 and a 3.5mm headphone jack. Before moving on to my in-game testing, I'd like to talk a bit about static dithering, FRC, frame rate control. This is something that's very common on monitors, including this model. And it allows the monitor or the user to perceive shades on the monitor which the monitor can't physically display. And what the monitor basically does is it alternates between a slightly lighter and slightly darker version of a given shade, and the perceived output to the user is a given shade between those two values which the monitor isn't physically outputting. Usually the fluctuations in brightness are very slight, so you get a very slightly darker and very slightly lighter version of the shade, and the monitor rapidly flicks between the two, and this is fairly passive to the user. You don't really notice much. That's the case with most shades displayed on this monitor as well. It's not like flickering you'd get from a backlight if PWM pulse width modulation is used, because this model doesn't use that. It's entirely flicker free regardless of the brightness you're using, so that's good. But dithering can be another source of flickering when it's applied too aggressively. Now this model, I did notice some quite aggressive examples of dithering. With the Twitter background as it is at the moment, this sort of lighter grey shade, it's much like other shades being displayed. You don't really notice the dithering. If, however, you actually go on a specific tweet, the shade becomes a sort of darker or medium dark shade, and the dithering becomes quite aggressive, and that means that the fluctuations in brightness are actually more pronounced. So it's flicking between a darker and lighter shade, but the differences between the two shades that it's flicking between are actually sufficient to cause a kind of flickering effect. Now I don't know if you'll be able to see this on the camera. I can certainly see it to my eyes, and I noticed it quite quickly. It isn't just this shade, it applies to various other shades. I didn't really notice it when I was gaming, although if I was looking out for it, I could see shades where this more aggressive dithering did apply to. So if you're sensitive to flickering, be aware of this. I didn't find it particularly bothersome, although I did notice it. I'm now running Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus, and I'm on a scene which I like for testing and talking about contrast on a monitor. This monitor uses a TN panel, and its specified contrast ratio is 1000:1, which is quite typical for the panel type. In my testing, it didn't quite reach 1000:1, and once I'd changed settings in my test settings and calibrated the monitor in that way, the contrast did drop a little bit. I think it was around 850:1, so not a huge difference from 1000:1, a little bit of a drop. Essentially though, the contrast's quite in line with what I'd expect from a modern TN panel. You don't get any IPS glow, so when you look at darker scenes or darker areas of the image, such as the dark areas there, you don't get a kind of bloom towards the bottom corners in particular from a normal viewing position, as you'd get on an IPS type model. So some users really dislike IPS glow, and it's nice not to have that. But being a TN model, it does have its own issues. Most noticeably, the perceived gamma changes depending on which part of the screen you're looking at. So this is due to viewing angle weaknesses, and they don't just apply when you're moving around and looking at the monitor from an odd angle. They also apply when you're just sitting at a desk looking at the monitor. The bottom of the screen has a significantly lower perceived gamma than the top of the screen, so if you calibrate the screen to the correct 2.2 gamma centrally, as I have done here, things look as they should. So the dark areas, they look pretty deep. There's some dark shades there that look quite deep. The level of detail is appropriate there. Lower down, you get extra detail. I'll see if I can give a bit of a better example. Yeah, so there's some sort of girders down here. Centrally, there's a fair level of detail, but things still look quite deep, some of the dark shades. If you view that towards the bottom of the screen, there's excessive detail. Again, I don't know how this will appear on the video, but I can see excessive detail lower down because the gamma has decreased. And towards the top of the screen, you'll probably see a more pronounced shift there. It just masks the detail. Everything's kind of very dull and blended, and that's because the perceived gamma is exceptionally high towards the top of TN models like this. This isn't specific to this model, it's completely typical for TN models. Some are a bit better than others in this respect, and this one is, I'd say, pretty average. It's not bad at all compared to the 24-inch 144Hz TN models. Even though they're smaller than this, the perceived gamma shifts are actually more pronounced. So just be aware of that. You don't get IPS glow, which is nice, but you do get these perceived gamma shifts, and it does affect this sort of atmosphere of dark scenes. And moving on to the lighter elements, they stand out pretty well. Again, the contrast's not exceptional. The screen surface, which I've already mentioned as well, it's medium matte anti-glare, so there's a bit of graininess to the lighter shades. They don't look particularly smooth or pure, but there's not a kind of heavy smeary graininess, so it's not really too bad in that respect. There's not much more to talk about in terms of the contrast performance, really. I'll be moving on to HDR a bit later and talk about that, but at the moment I'm running it in SDR, so everything I'm talking about here is just with the monitor running its normal SDR and set up according to my test settings as per the written review. I'm now going to be looking at the colour reproduction attributes of the monitor, and to start off I'm going to be looking at the Lagom.nl viewing angle tests. This highlights some of the weaknesses I've already talked about in relation to contrast in terms of the perceived gamma shifts. These also change the saturation of colours at different points of the screen. So the Lagom text test, it should really look a blended grey throughout the screen, but on TN models like this it typically looks red, as it does here, so it has red striping to it. If you move the camera or move your eyes in relation to this, you can start seeing green colours, orange as well. If you go lower down, there's a bit of green to the striping, quite a saturated green eventually. And these kind of shifts are perfectly typical for TN models. Looking at solid colours, such as the pink block, you can see that it's a more sort of lilac, quite saturated lilac colour towards the top, and it has more of a pink hue lower down. And again, if you move your viewing angle relative to the screen, you can see the pink hue sort of bloom out and follow you around. And again, it's perfectly typical for a TN model. Same with the red. It looks a sort of more saturated, a deeper red towards the top, and it looks a kind of pinkish red towards the bottom, and it's kind of a burnt hue between that. The green block, again, it looks more of a kind of yellow green towards the bottom, and a bit more of a sort of pure green further up, but it always has a bit of a yellowish tint, and that's due to the colour gamut of this monitor not being particularly wide. The blue block, as normal, looks fairly consistent throughout. I'm now running Battlefield 1 to give you some in-game examples of the colour reproduction of the monitor. So the shifts I've talked about, they exist in-game, but you don't have such large areas of solid colour, so the saturation shifts aren't quite as obvious. However, you do notice, or at least I notice, the image does appear more saturated towards the top of the image than the bottom. You can see that sand, for example, has a particularly rich red hue, a very rich sort of red-brown hue towards the top. And if you view that towards the centre, the hue lessens. Towards the bottom, the hue is pretty much gone entirely and it looks more of a kind of clay-like colour. However, the overall look of the image is fairly rich and natural. The colour gamut of this monitor is a bit beyond sRGB in some regions and a little bit of under coverage in other. I actually measured 97% sRGB coverage. So you don't get the kind of levels of saturation and vibrancy you would on a model with a wider colour gamut. But things don't look washed out as they would with a model which has obvious issues with its central gamma handling. So some of the 144Hz TN models are particularly renowned for this. They have gamma which, no matter what you do in the OSD, just is too low, and things look washed out overall. This model, on the other hand, it has much better gamma tracking, it has good flexibility in the OSD to change the gamma as well, so it does look richer than that. There are some fairly decent saturated shades. The sky blue, for example, you would notice if there's a gamma issue that would look obviously faded and it just wouldn't look very nice at all. With a model with a wider colour gamut, you would notice extra saturation there and it does lift things up a bit, but again it doesn't really look washed out. And overall it gives this game sort of the gritty aesthetic that it craves and what the developers intend for the game. Now running the monitor in HDR. When you're running it in HDR, as I explore in the calibration section of the written review, there are two HDR modes. Basically, the difference between them is HDR looks a bit more washed out, Cinema HDR has a bit more depth. It essentially looks like the gamma is universally increased, and that's pretty much what happens with Cinema HDR. The near-term target for HDR10 content, be it PC games such as this, or console games, or HDR movies, it's actually DCI-P3, so this monitor comes nowhere near that. In an ideal world, you'd have colours which the game developer intends to be more saturated. There'd be some quite deep, lush greens. Explosions on the game would have a really vibrant quality to them. You don't get that because the colour gamut's more restricted. And overall, you don't get the kind of more muted shades appearing quite as muted as they should either. Things actually look a bit oversaturated in places. The sky, for example, the lighter blues of the sky look just sort of pulled towards darker blue than they should, and the sand has a kind of orange hue to it which it shouldn't really have. It should look more dusty and more neutral than it does. So it doesn't really look as it should in HDR, but that's because of the restrictions of the colour gamut. Things don't look washed out, at least, so especially in the Cinema HDR mode, so it's got that going for it in this respect. Another aspect of HDR is contrast. And this is arguably the most important aspect of HDR, and for a proper HDR experience it really is vitally important. This monitor isn't even VESA Display HDR 400 certified, which means it doesn't even achieve the lowest level of VESA certification in terms of its HDR. Now, one of the reasons for that is that the peak luminance under HDR is no higher than it is under SDR, or certainly isn't significantly higher, so it doesn't even reach 400 candles per meter squared. Ideally, for a proper HDR experience though, it's not just about high brightness, it's also about the monitor being able to simultaneously display very bright light shades and very deep dark shades at the same time. And that requires a local dimming solution on the backlight. So if you look at the brighter elements such as the flame and the moon up there, ideally they'd be brighter than they are here, and they'd really stand out well because the surrounding area would be much darker. In this case, things really just look kind of flooded overall. The dark areas, the dark building interior, for example, it just looks washed out. It really just looks quite flooded. And this is even with the Cinema HDR setting, which is a little bit better in this respect, but the regular HDR setting looks even more flooded. So there just is an obvious lack of depth to the dark shades, and that's because the backlight brightness is far too high for those shades to be displayed with appropriate black level or appropriate depth. And it also means that the bright elements don't stand out properly. One aspect of HDR, it's not just about what the backlight's doing, it's also about accurately mapping things. The tones are mapped more accurately or more carefully in an HDR, so you get an increased level of visibility in dark areas, which is quite good. But really the purpose of that for a proper HDR monitor would be that it's coordinated with changes in the backlight luminance, so that allows you to have a really fine sort of distinction between very dark shades and extremely dark shades and slightly lighter shades. So they all look atmospheric and deep, but there's still a distinction of detail. This monitor doesn't do that because it doesn't have that level of control of the luminance. The monitor does support 10-bit colour, but that's sort of really a basic requirement of HDR, is that 10-bit processing is supported. This monitor uses 8-bit plus FRC dithering, and I didn't mention dithering before, but for HDR purposes that attribute's just fine. It's not really a problem with that, but it's really the backlight control is far too simple, and everything's controlled as one unit, and that really doesn't allow HDR to work properly. At the higher end, the luminance of this moon, for example, the very bright shade should appear brighter than the slightly less bright shades on the moon. So usually there's a sort of beautiful glow that you'd get on a proper HDR monitor. And by proper, I mean really, I'd say VESA Display HDR 600 or above. You'd get a kind of nice glow to the really bright shades, the very crater detail to the moon, which would also stand out nicely. On this, it kind of just looks like a bright blob. There is some crater detail if you're viewing the moon from just the right angle, but it's really not distinct, and it doesn't have the kind of beautiful standout effect that you'd expect from an HDR screen. I'm now going to disable HDR, and to do that you can't just press the HDR button. I mentioned that elsewhere. You actually have to control it through the game itself. So I should also mention, do run through the HDR calibration on any game you're running, because that'll help fine-tune things appropriately, and I have done that on this title, although it doesn't really matter what I set this to, it doesn't improve the overall HDR experience. So I'm now disabling HDR just so I'll be able to show you what this scene looks like in SDR. The depth is now much better, it has a more atmospheric look, the detail levels aren't as good, and I'd say perhaps the moon doesn't have quite as much detail, and the rays from the moon aren't as distinct as they were in HDR. So there are some slight advantages to HDR in terms of the careful processing, but I just prefer the look in SDR. I feel it looks richer, it looks more atmospheric, and HDR on this monitor really is, okay, some users might quite like it, but to someone like me who's seen much better HDR, it's really quite a weak implementation. I'm running Battlefield 1 again. I've got my AMD GPU in my system, which sounds obnoxiously loud. I can barely hear myself think, so I'm sorry if you can hear an annoying thrashing noise in the background. I will be upgrading this AMD GPU at some point because it's really annoying me now. But that aside, I'm going to talk about pixel responsiveness and just responsiveness in general on this monitor. This is a scene which I like to use to talk about pixel responsiveness on Battlefield 1 because it has a good range of pixel transitions and it shows plenty of high contrast transitions which monitors sometimes struggle with. There's lots of lighter and darker shades moving against one another. An important concept to understand for this section is perceived blur, and that's explored in some detail in the written review and also in an article we've got on the factors affecting responsiveness on a monitor. But essentially, some of the perceived blur you see is due to pixel responses on the monitor, but the majority you'll see on a modern monitor actually comes from the movement of your own eyes as you track motion on the screen, and that's linked to the refresh rate of the monitor and also the frame rate that the content's running at, which will be up to a maximum of the refresh rate of the monitor. So this is a 60Hz monitor. I'm running the game at 60 frames a second, and there's a moderate amount of perceived blur due to eye movement, and even if this had a 0.001 millisecond response time for all pixel transitions, you'd still see this kind of level of perceived blur on a sample and hold monitor such as this. Again, if this sounds like a load of strange jargon, I'd definitely recommend reading the article on our website, or at least the section of the written review which summarises this. The other element of perceived blur is pixel responsiveness. This monitor has a specified 1 millisecond pixel response time, but as always, take these specified values with a huge grain of salt. They are utter rubbish. They're for nothing more than marketing, really. And there are some definite weaknesses on this model, beyond what you'd expect from an actual 1 millisecond response time. First of all, there is a moderate amount of overshoot, or a fairly widespread level of overshoot. I notice this in lots of transitions. It's generally quite faint though, so most users won't actually notice it. There are some slightly stronger examples. The horse here, for example, has a bit of a kind of bright trail behind it. I don't know if that'll come out on the video, it's difficult to tell. It's sometimes difficult to capture on the video, but there's definitely a bright, what I call a halo trail behind the horse, and that's brighter than the background colour and certainly brighter than the horse colour. So it kind of stands out a bit as a bright trail. There's also some weaknesses in terms of slower than optimal pixel responses. So if you look at the icon above the horse, for example, there's actually what I call a kind of maybe a heavy powdery trail behind the object. It's not particularly bold and it's not smeary in appearance. It's not like what you might get on some VA models, but it does stand out. It appears like the object's kind of repeated in a fainter version of itself behind it. And again, I don't know if this will come out on the video, and it can be very difficult to capture on a video, but there is that. Also, the moon in the sky has something similar. It has a kind of repetition of itself as you move the mouse. And that ideally wouldn't be there, and it certainly wouldn't be there if it was actually a 1 millisecond pixel response time performed perfectly without any overshoot or anything. The most obvious examples of overshoot on this model tend to be where dark transitions occur. So there's some dark shades such as the telegraph post here and significantly lighter shades in the background. And this will give, similar to what I showed you on the horse, but some more obvious examples of it. There's an obvious bright trail behind the wires up there, for example, and the telegraph post. There's a kind of fringe of halo trailing around the rocks as well. And you can see it here, a more obvious example. And sometimes it's quite colourful. Up there it kind of has some slightly purple and green effect to it as well. I mean, I find this fairly eye-catching, but individual sensitivity to overshoot does vary. Not everyone's really going to find it bothersome, but it certainly is a feature on this monitor. I should also mention that I've got the pixel overdrive set to high, AMA, Advanced Motion Acceleration. I've got that set to high at the moment, which I do consider optimal, even with this overshoot and other issues, but if you have that set to off, the overshoot does disappear. However, there are some obvious weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. So the moon now has a kind of smeary appearance to it as you move, and again, I don't know how this is going to appear on the video, but the overall level of perceived blur is significantly increased due to weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. So I would generally recommend setting the AMA to high. There's also a premium setting, but that's not useful at all. It simply uses far too aggressive grey-to-grey acceleration. So with the premium setting, you can now see obvious overshoot. There's a very dark trail behind the moon, and there's a really obvious sort of disco-like bright cyan trail behind the rocks there, and the same around the telegraph post. So it's really unattractive and not something most users are going to want to use. So I think AMA high really presents the optimal performance on this monitor for most users. I'll just set the AMA back to high, but it's worth remembering that these examples I'm showing you here are examples of where the overshoot and some of the slower than optimal pixel transitions are most obvious. Overall, the monitor does provide a competent 60 Hz performance, and most of the pixel transitions are performed optimally within the constraints of the 60 Hz refresh rate. So there are some slightly less obvious examples of overshoot here. There's sort of a little bit of a bright trail behind the edges of the vehicle there, and the tools as well. But these are really quite faint, and most users won't really notice them. So most of the overshoot on this model is more like that. It's not really particularly eye-catching. There are some more obvious eye-catching examples as I've shown you here. I'm also going to talk about AMD FreeSync. This monitor supports AMD FreeSync on compatible AMD GPUs, such as the extremely loud Radeon 290 I've got in my system at the moment. So what that means is, if the frame rate drops below 60 frames a second, which it often does if your GPU is not massively powerful, or you're running a game with higher graphics settings, or you're just running a more graphically demanding title. So I'll bump everything up to Ultra now to try and get the frame rate to dip a bit. And you can see that it's now closer to 50 frames a second most of the time. And there is a decrease in what I call connected feel, so you don't feel quite as connected to the game world as you move the mouse around. And there's also an increase in perceived blur. But the FreeSync window of this, the variable refresh rate range of this model, is only 40 to 60 Hz. That's quite typical, to be honest, for 60 Hz FreeSync models. I'm not sort of singling this monitor out, but it does mean that if your frame rate drops below 40 frames a second, then FreeSync deactivates. But considering the weaknesses I've talked about, they exist with FreeSync on, but you don't get obvious tearing or stuttering. So without FreeSync on, you get obvious stuttering if you've got VSync enabled, or obvious tearing if you've got VSync disabled. And they're obvious to me. Individual sensitivity to them does vary, but generally speaking, users of 60 Hz monitors like this do find FreeSync to be quite a benefit if you're frequently dropping below 60 frames a second. If I increase the graphics settings further, so I'll up my resolution scale a bit. I should then bring things closer to the 40 frames a second floor of operation. They've actually dropped below 40 frames a second now, so or they keep fluctuating a bit above and a bit below. So FreeSync does completely deactivate when it's close to that 40 frames a second, or it drops below 40 frames a second. And with FreeSync activated, definitely is a difference, a positive difference in my mind. That the stuttering and tearing I find really obvious and obnoxious, and I like not having that. But near the 40 frames a second, compared to 60 frames a second, the perceived blur is certainly higher and the connected feel is not as good. Taking FreeSync out of the equation and just considering the monitor more generally, I should mention input lag, because that's really very low indeed on this monitor. It's actually the lowest input lag I've measured on a 60 Hz UHD monitor. It was actually a bit below 3 milliseconds, so that indicates a very low signal delay, and it does mean that input lag is really not an issue to worry about with this model at all. Even if you're particularly sensitive to that, this monitor isn't going to cause you any issues. To wrap up then, the monitor provides a decent contrast performance overall. It is quite in line with what I'd expect from a modern TN panel. So it isn't going to kind of blow you away in terms of contrast, but it doesn't have any IPS glow, and to some users that will be quite a nice advantage. It does, however, have obvious perceived gamma shifts vertically, as any TN model does, and these do vary a bit between different TN models, but for a monitor of this size, a TN model of this size, the gamma shifts are certainly not extreme, and they're not as extreme as you'd see on your typical 24-inch 144 Hz TN model, for example. And the static contrast, I didn't quite record 1000 to 1, especially after I'd made the adjustments to my test settings. It wasn't too far off, and again, fairly typical for a TN model. Certainly not up to the levels you'd see on a decent VA model or anything like that. This monitor uses a medium matte anti-glare screen surface, and I found that a bit grainier than I'd ideally like, especially for a monitor of this pixel density, but it wasn't too bad. There wasn't an obvious smeary graininess. It's just something I'm quite sensitive to, and I do prefer lighter matte screen surfaces or even glossy screen surfaces myself. The colour reproduction, again, being a TN model, you've got those perceived gamma shifts, so there are shifts in saturation, and saturation's noticeably weaker towards the bottom of the screen than the top, and there's actually a bit of oversaturation towards the top of the screen, even considering a perfect calibration centrally. However, the nice thing is that the monitor, even though it does have the TN panel and it has the weaknesses associated with that, it does have quite a nice setup, and it has a good flexible OSD, and it allows you to have good central gamma tracking and actually gives you quite a bit of flexibility around that to increase the richness a bit if you want. So it certainly doesn't have the washed out look that some TN models have, no matter what you do in the OSD. This monitor doesn't have an obvious central gamut issue, and that's a big plus for this one. The colour gamut extends a little bit beyond sRGB in some regions, and there's a bit of undercoverage in other regions. So it doesn't provide the kind of vibrant pop that you get from a screen with a much more generous colour gamut, and quite a few screens these days, especially ones with HDR capability, will target the DCI P3 colour space because that's the near-term target for HDR. This monitor doesn't reach that kind of level, but again, it doesn't really look washed out. It looks fairly natural and reasonably rich overall. Speaking of HDR, that's something I would completely forget this monitor even has. It might as well not have it. It's really just there for marketing. It's even got a nice little shiny copper HDR logo, but really it just upsets the image. The monitor doesn't tick enough boxes for proper HDR performance. It doesn't have any local dimming on the backlight. The colour gamut, as I've mentioned, is way more restricted than DCI P3. It does offer 10-bit colour support, but that's really neither here nor there, especially when it doesn't tick the other boxes for HDR. So enabling HDR on this monitor doesn't really do much. It just increases the overall brightness of the image up to levels that you'd see anyway with SDR and brightness on 100 or particularly bright, and it kind of activates a dynamic contrast mode. So for darker scenes it does dim the backlight a bit, but it is all controlled as one unit, so it can't account for intricate mixtures. And the whole point in high dynamic range is really that you can have very bright elements and very dark elements shown at the same time, with dimming zones on the backlight or per pixel illumination, allowing the bright elements to really stand out and the darker elements to look really deep and atmospheric. That doesn't happen at all on this monitor. The responsiveness of this monitor, it's a bit of a mixed bag overall, and certainly if you look at the specified 1 millisecond response time and you don't know enough about monitors, perhaps you haven't seen my reviews in the past, you might think that that's amazing, so it's going to be really fast. But in practice, it is a 60Hz monitor, so the pixel responses aren't that important in the grand scheme of things, not as important as they would be on a much higher refresh rate model. And overall, the level of perceived blur is much as you'd see on any 60Hz monitor. However, there are some weaknesses that stand out above that. In particular, there's some fairly eye-catching overshoot in places, and there are also some slower than optimal pixel transitions, giving you a bit of trailing beyond what you'd ideally see. Overall though, really fairly decent 60Hz performance. So really this monitor provides a fairly decent experience overall. I think you have to really have in mind the fact that it is a cheap monitor for a 4K model, especially looking at the current UK retail prices. It's one of the most affordable 4K UHD screens out there. And it does have a fairly large screen size, 28 inches, so it's pretty generous in terms of the screen space as well. The monitor's also fairly cut down in terms of the ergonomic flexibility in ports. It just has a few HDMI ports and a few extras, and it has a fairly simple look with some matte black plastic, some matte grey plastics and a bit of glossy plastic, but a fairly simple look overall. No super thin bezels or anything like that either. It's a fixed tilt-only stand, although it does have VESA holes at the back if you want to mount it to a more flexible solution. As I've mentioned, HDR really it doesn't add significantly to the price anyway, so I wouldn't really mark it down for having a pretty cruddy HDR implementation, because good HDR implementations come at a significantly higher price tag anyway. I should also mention the Brightness Intelligence Plus feature. Again, it's a bit of a headline feature. I've used it on several BenQ monitors before. I don't find it useful at all. I'm not going to say any more about that, except to say that the light sensor is a kind of a prominent feature below the BenQ logo. The light sensor itself works quite well, but the feature is not really a very good use of the light sensor. So that's really all there is to the BenQ EL2870U. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.